Hey there. Tonight we're heading back, not to warm castles or candlelit feasts, but to smoke-filled huts and frozen earth. This is winter in the Middle Ages, the real one. No glory, no armour, just peasants doing their best to survive months of cold, hunger and silence. Snow drifted through the roof. Bread turned to stone. Wolves came closer. And every day you got up and did it all again. If slow, grounded history helps you unwind, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it actually brings you peace. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's strangely comforting to know who else is out there. So, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Wrap yourself in something warm. And let's begin in a season that didn't just test people, it tried to end them. You don't need a calendar to know when winter's coming. You feel it. In the bones first. They stiffen like yesterday's bread. Then in the sky, which goes from blue to a kind of reluctant grey. And finally in the animals, who start looking at you with quiet suspicion, as if they know something you don't. And they usually do. Autumn doesn't end. It retreats. Slowly. Leaves fall, sure. But it's not just that. It's the way the wind changes direction. It starts slipping through the gaps in the cottage, exploring the place like an uninvited guest, poking around, finding where the warmth lives and evicting it. The chickens grow quieter. The dog stops barking at the wind and begins listening to it instead. That's how you know it's nearly time. The sun, when it shows up at all, feels thin, as if it's forgotten how to be warm. And everyone walks just a bit faster, not because they're in a hurry, but because standing still hurts more now. There's no grand announcement, no snowstorm with a flourish. Winter arrives like debt, quietly and with a great deal of consequence. The first task, always, is denial. You pretend the cold is temporary, a chill, nothing more. You wear the same tunic you wore in October, but now with a cloak that's more whole than fabric. You tell yourself you'll mend it. You won't. Not because you're lazy, but because the needle's bent and the threads run out, and your fingers are too numb to hold either. We talk a lot about preparation, as if we were always ready. But let's be honest, most winters arrive when we're not quite finished with autumn. There's always a corner of the roof you meant to fix, or wood you meant to chop. Always something still left in the garden that didn't get dried or salted or stored in time. Still, you do what you can. You stuff straw between the gaps in the wall. You drape cloth over the doorway. You rearrange the beds so everyone sleeps a little closer to the hearth. Even Uncle Gawain, who smells like sheep and talks in his sleep about debts no one remembers. You don't light fires all day. That's a luxury. Wood is for evenings, for cooking, and for the hour or so when everyone pretends to be cheerful. The rest of the time, you rely on movement, layering, and the heat of several reluctant siblings pressed together under one scratchy blanket. The animals sense it too. They linger longer near the shelter. The chickens huddle. The pigs go quiet, which is deeply unsettling. The cows grow more irritable, which is to say, they remain exactly the same. Outside, the ground turns to iron. The paths that were muddy last week are now treacherous, half-frozen ruts that twist ankles and swallow boots. Water in the bucket develops a skin of ice. You break it each morning with a ladle, then curse softly as it numbs your hands. And the sky. The sky just hangs there, low, grey, expectant, like it's waiting for something. You squint at it as if you might read it, as if clouds carry messages. They don't, but they do mean you won't see the sun again for several weeks. In town, people walk faster. They speak in shorter sentences. Jokes dry up. No one's really in the mood. Even the church sermons get a little darker. The priest reminds you that cold weather is God's way of encouraging humility. You wonder if God might try a slightly warmer lesson plan. And then, finally, one morning, it happens. Snow. Not a blizzard, not yet. Just a dusting. Like flour spilled across the fields. But it changes everything. The thatch turns white. The trees stiffen. Your breath comes out in little clouds, and every step outside sounds like you're stepping on old parchment. And with that snow comes the realization you're locked in now. The earth has closed up shop for the season. No more digging, no more planting. Nothing will grow. What you've already stored is all you've got. And if you didn't store enough, well, you'll learn how thin stew can really get. You begin to count things differently. Not in days, but in bundles. How many bundles of firewood left? How many sacks of grain? How many turnips? How many eggs this week? Not many, as the hens stop laying when it's cold. They prefer to huddle near the fire, just like everyone else. You keep yourself busy, even if nothing feels productive. You mend clothes, you scrape pans, you stir ashes, hoping a warm coal is hiding underneath. If there's time, and there often is, you spin wool. It's not just for making cloth. It's for keeping your hands moving, your mind occupied. Too much quiet, and your thoughts start getting ideas. The animals aren't just company. They're cohabitants. The warmer ones are invited inside. Not all at once. There are boundaries after all, but enough to turn the house into a communal stew of smells, sounds, and shared body heat. You get used to waking up with a goat breathing on your neck. Well, maybe not used to, but you stop fighting it. Evenings are the worst. The sun disappears too early, and the darkness arrives like it's angry about something. Candles are expensive. Tallow lamps are smoky. You sit near the fire, if there's one going, and you listen. To stories. To wind. To the way the wood pops when it burns. Sometimes someone gets it in their head to tell a ghost story. This always seems like a good idea, until you realise you have to walk across the freezing yard to use the privy afterward. You run. You try not to trip. You definitely don't look into the shadows. And yet, winter isn't all misery. There's a rhythm to it. A kind of bitter predictability. You know the chores. You know the limits. And there's a strange camaraderie in knowing everyone else is miserable too. You learn to find comfort in small victories. Warm feet for 5 minutes. A stew that tastes slightly less like despair. A day without wind cutting through the cracks in the wall. You celebrate quietly, because the moment you laugh too loud, someone will remind you we've only just begun. Historically, we peasants didn't fare too well in winters. The little ice age, starting around the 14th century, brought harsher, longer winters across Europe. Rivers froze. Crops failed. In some years, the Rhine froze solid for months, and markets were held right on the ice. Yes, people shopped on frozen rivers, until the ice decided otherwise. In particularly bad years, like 1315 to 1317, rain ruined crops for seasons. It wasn't just cold, it was famine. Up to 30 million people affected. And when there's no food, people get imaginative. Cannibalism was whispered about. Infanticide too. Not dinner table conversation, but then again, we didn't always have dinner. But that's the thing about winter. It's not just about enduring the cold. It's about enduring each other. A family of 6, 3 goats, 2 chickens, and a bucket of salted fish sharing 20 square feet of living space? That's a social experiment with no exit. You hear every cough, every complaint, every unfortunate digestive development. Privacy becomes a myth. Modesty goes out with the sunlight. You do your best not to argue, not out of patience, but because it stirs up the air and lets in more cold. And so you settle in. You shrink your world down to a few feet around the fire. You learn the weight of every blanket, the creak of every board, the rhythm of the weather. Days shorten, nights lengthen, and time starts to dissolve into a sort of frozen soup. You're not living, exactly. You're enduring. And eventually, you stop asking how long winter will last. You just wake up each day and survive that one. If you're lucky, the firewood holds out. If you're very lucky, the roof does too. Because in a medieval winter, the cold doesn't knock. It lets itself in. And stays a while. And tomorrow it starts again. Winter doesn't just try to kill you with cold. It kills you with chores. And at the top of that frozen to-do list? Wood. Endless amounts of it. You don't just need a few logs for ambience. You need firewood like your life depends on it, because it does. Everything revolves around fire. It cooks your food, warms your bones, dries your socks, scares off rats, and makes the house only mostly uninhabitable. Without it, you're not a peasant. You're a popsicle with taxes. But fire doesn't magically appear. It takes wood, lots of it. Cut, carried, chopped, stacked and cursed at. Gathering firewood is the medieval equivalent of having a second full-time job, except this one pays in back pain and frostbite. There's no chainsaw, no gas-powered anything. Just an axe that's been in the family so long you're not sure if it's a tool or an heirloom. The handle's cracked, the blade is blunt. But it's still better than using your hands, which, let's face it, you probably will anyway once the axe gets stuck in the 3rd log. You start in autumn, of course. Everyone says that. Start early. Except there's never enough time. The harvest runs late, your neighbour borrowed your axe, and you sprained your ankle trying to outrun an angry goose. So here you are in December, swinging steel at a tree like it insulted your mother, praying it falls in the right direction. And trees don't cooperate. They're heavy, unpredictable, and covered in snow. You cut one down, only to realise you still have to chop it, carry it, and stack it. Repeat 50 times. If you're lucky, your back just hurts. If you're not, the tree lands on you and you become a cautionary tale. Once the wood is chopped, it needs to dry. That takes months. So you burn it wet, which means it smokes, hisses, and barely burns at all. Congratulations. You've just turned your home into a tepid, smoky nightmare. Hope you weren't planning to breathe properly this winter. The rich, of course, have options. They hire people. They send servants into the woods while they sip wine in front of a roaring hearth. You are the servant, and your hearth is mostly a pile of wet twigs trying their best. Legally, you're not even allowed to gather wood in some places. Forests belong to lords. And if you're caught collecting kindling on noble land, the punishment ranges from fines to beatings to, occasionally, being made an example of. For picking up sticks. Yes, really. That's why many peasants turn to alternatives. things like peat, dried animal dung, or bundles of brush. These technically burn in the same way that technically soup counts as a meal. Peat gives off heat, but it also gives off a smell like wet ashes and regret. Dung burns surprisingly well, but let's not pretend anyone's happy about it. Still, you use what you have. You gather dried cow patties with frozen hands and pretend you're not inhaling memories of last summer's pasture. The good news? It's free. The bad news? Your cottage now smells like a campfire held inside a barn. Stacking firewood is an art. Too tight and it moulds. Too loose and it falls over and breaks your toe. So you build a neat pile against the wall of your house, wrap it with whatever canvas you can steal from your cousin, and hope it doesn't collapse under snow. It will. And you never have enough. That's the golden rule. Doesn't matter how much wood you cut. It's never enough. By February, you're down to burning fence posts, old furniture, or anything that vaguely resembles timber. There's no sentimentality. If it catches fire, it's fuel. You dream of firewood. You count logs instead of sheep. You have actual arguments over who burned the good stick too early. You ration embers. You hoard coals like they're treasure. And if you manage to find a particularly dry branch under the snow, you bring it home like a war trophy. Sleeping in winter is a gamble. If the fire dies out, the temperature inside drops to hope you wrote a will. You tuck in close, under layers of blankets, furs and other humans. Not because you like them, but because survival beats personal space. In some homes, livestock sleep inside too. Not out of kindness, out of necessity. Chickens provide eggs and ambient warmth. Pigs are radiators with hooves. Cows are basically space heaters that moo. It's not cosy. It's crowded, noisy, and smells like a petting zoo collapsed into a soup kitchen. But it's marginally better than freezing to death. Historically, peasants didn't just rely on personal effort. Communities often worked together to chop and haul wood. It was less about bonding and more about shared suffering. Everyone had blisters. Everyone was freezing. Everyone was equally miserable, which made it slightly easier to endure. In some regions, people used wood-saving tricks. Clay ovens were shared. Communal fires were maintained all day. You'd take turns baking bread in the village oven, all while pretending not to notice how warm Agnes's house always seemed to be. Suspiciously warm, in fact. Women and children gathered kindling, not because it was easier, but because that's just how the labour got divided. If you were small and had fingers, you were sent to the woods with a basket and told not to come back empty. What you returned with might have been twigs, might have been pine cones. Either way you contributed, and then there's chopping itself, a deeply medieval kind of misery. Your gloves, if you have them, are soaked through in minutes. Your fingers go numb, the axe slips, the wood splits wrong. Something hits your shin. You yell, not because it helps, but because that's all you've got left. By midwinter, the ground's too hard to chop into. Your hands have more splinters than skin, and you still haven't figured out where half your woodpile disappeared to. Spoiler, your neighbour borrowed it again, and yet you keep going, because fire is non-negotiable. It's warmth. It's food. It's the difference between making it to spring or becoming the reason your cottage smells even worse. When you sit by the fire at night, tired, sore, and lightly smoked, you feel something like peace. Not comfort, just the absence of immediate doom, which, in the Middle Ages, is as close as you're going to get. Of course, some winters are worse than others. You remember the bad ones by name. The winter of 43 when the roof collapsed, or the long freeze when the river turned to stone and everyone tried ice skating in wooden shoes. Some didn't make it. A few froze. A few just left and never came back. You stop asking questions after a while. The firewood dwindles. The wind whistles. You find yourself eyeing furniture a little differently. That stool you never liked suddenly looks flammable. Sentiment gives way to survival. If it burns, it's valuable. Eventually the fall comes. The snow retreats like a tired thief. The mud returns. Your boots vanish somewhere in it. But you made it. You survived another medieval winter without running out of wood, without freezing to death, and without strangling your cousin for stealing your best log. That's the victory. No medals, no parade, just frostbitten fingers, permanent smoke smell, and the deeply satisfying knowledge that you're not a popsicle. Not this year anyway. The next morning you do it all over again, because even as spring edges closer, the cold lingers. The chores never stop. And the fire, that fickle, flickering little god, always wants more. More wood, more sweat, more of you. And you give it. Because in the end, it's not about comfort. It's about survival, one splinter at a time. And tomorrow, same routine. Chop, stack, burn, freeze, repeat. You don't beat winter. You survive it. And if you're lucky, next year's axe won't break before your spirit does. Because in the end, winter doesn't care how tired you are. The logs won't chop themselves. The fire won't feed itself. And warmth, that rare, fleeting thing, has to be earned every single day. You don't need a calendar to know it's winter. Your stomach tells you first, loudly, repeatedly. It's not hunger in the modern sense. That gentle rumble that reminds you to check the fridge. It's deeper, angrier. The kind of emptiness that makes you stare at bark and wonder, could I stew that? Food in a medieval winter is like firewood. Always running out, never easy to get, and guaranteed to cause arguments. You don't plan meals. You ration them. You stretch them. You look at 3 shriveled turnips and call it a feast. You start with what you've stored. Grains mostly. Barley, rye, oats. Wheat if you're rich, or stealing from someone who is. You keep them in sacks, barrels, or anything that keeps out rats. Which is nothing. The rats always find a way. They're like furry tax collectors with teeth. Most of your meals revolve around pottage, the medieval mystery stew. It's not so much a recipe as a lifelong experiment. You throw in whatever's edible and hope it doesn't kill you. Root vegetables, dried beans, wilted greens, maybe a strip of dried pork if you've got royal connections or a generous neighbour. It simmers for days, sometimes weeks. New ingredients are just added to the pot. Old ones never quite leave. It tastes like boiled earth, with a hint of onion and regret. You eat it anyway, every day, twice a day if you're lucky, not because you like it, but because it's there. And in winter, that's enough. Meat is rare. You don't have a freezer. You don't even have a cold cellar, just a slightly less awful corner of the cottage. If you did slaughter something in the fall, a pig, a goat, your neighbour's least favourite chicken, you salt it, smoke it, dry it, and then hide it from everyone in the house, especially the kids. Kids will eat anything, including raw bacon and the string you tied it with. Sometimes you fish. If the river isn't frozen, if the ice isn't too thick, And if you haven't already burned your fishing rod for kindling. Ice fishing is a thing, just not a fun thing. You chip away at a hole in the ice while your toes slowly lose sensation. Then you sit, wait, and contemplate how life became a series of increasingly stupid decisions. If you're near the sea, you might dry some herring or smoke eel. It's nutritious. It's long-lasting. And it tastes exactly how it sounds. If you're not near water, you rely on whatever your neighbours didn't guard well enough. Bread is essential, but it's also a gamble. Made from whatever flour you've got, rye, barley, sometimes lentils, and often padded out with filler. Sawdust, yes. Grounder corns, maybe. Bark, on a bad year. Bread isn't soft and fluffy. It's a blunt object. Something between food and medieval defence weapon. And sometimes the bread fights back. In damp storage, rye can grow a fungus called ergot, a delightful little microbe that causes hallucinations, convulsions, and occasionally death. You don't know this. All you know is that the bread makes you see colours, scream at clouds, and possibly become a religious visionary, or a witch, depending on who's watching. Dairy helps. If you have animals that haven't frozen, wandered off, or been eaten. Milk spoils quickly, so you turn it into butter or cheese. The cheese is hard, salty, and vaguely threatening. Butter's a luxury. You keep it wrapped in cloth, hidden under your bed like it's gold. Because in winter, it basically is. Eggs? Not likely. Chickens slow down in the cold. They're too busy trying not to die. You might get 1 a week, maybe 2 if you speak nicely to the hens and threaten the rooster. That egg goes in the pottage, or you stare at it long enough to get full from imagination. Fresh fruits and vegetables? That's adorable. No apples, no greens. Maybe a dried plum from last August, if it didn't rot or become home to a worm. Most vitamin C comes from sour cabbage or fermented turnip, lovingly described as crunchy disappointment in vinegar. It keeps scurvy away, but also friends. Preservation is everything. You salt, smoke, pickle, and dry anything that once moved, grew, or was near something that did. You make jams from berries, if you managed to find them, and didn't eat them all in a sugar-starved frenzy last summer. You hang herbs from the ceiling, until they drop into the soup one by one like leafy confetti. Nothing is wasted. Bones are boiled twice. The fat is saved. Even the ashes from the fire end up in soap or used to scrub pots. If someone throws away food, you question their sanity. Or you marry them, because clearly they're wealthy enough to waste things. And then there's hunger itself. Not mild hunger. Not I skipped lunch hunger. But the kind that makes you feel your stomach rubbing against your spine. The kind that makes you chew slowly, not for flavour, but to make it last. Hunger's a full-time presence in winter. It sits with you, watches you cook, comments on your portions, judges your neighbour's squirrel stew, and says, actually, that looks all right. There's a rhythm to it. You wake up hungry. You go to bed still hungry. You learn to live with the gnawing feeling, like a mouse chewing inside your belly. Eventually, you stop noticing. Until you smell stew from a neighbour's hut and immediately consider selling a sibling. Even the better off peasants don't eat well. They just eat slightly more of the same bland, mealy disappointment. Occasionally, someone manages a real treat. Honeycomb, fresh apple slices, a slice of salted beef the size of a coin. It's a celebration. Not for the flavour, but for the reminder that life isn't always awful. And then come the lean years, the bad harvests, the crop failures. You remember the winter of 1316, or at least the stories. Heavy rains drowned the fields, rot set in, grain yields collapsed, livestock starved, entire villages went hungry. They call it the Great Famine, not for dramatic flair, but because it really was that bad. Some people ate roots, some ate moss. Some, well, let's just say medieval cookbooks don't list stewed shoe leather for nothing. Monks kept records, bless them. They wrote about entire families vanishing, about parents choosing which child got the last crust, about people found dead in snowdrifts, clutching turnips like treasure. It's not folklore. It's the forgotten footnotes of history. And when you do find food, the fire's gone out. So you eat cold stew by candlelight, huddled under a fur that still smells like the animal it came from. And you're grateful, because at least it's food. At least you get to chew something that isn't your own lip. Meals are short, the hunger is long. You scrape your bowl clean, not out of manners, but because you need every crumb. You lick your fingers. You scrape the pot. You consider eating the pot. Then remember it's your only one. Your body changes. You move slower. You lose weight. You don't call it dieting. You call it still alive. And yet you keep going. Because hunger is a fact, not a crisis. You don't expect to feel full. You just hope not to feel worse. That's winter. Not a battle, but a negotiation between you, your pantry, and the number of meals until April. There's no holiday feast unless you're lucky or well connected. Maybe you save a sausage for Christmas. Maybe a neighbour shares a pie made with mystery meat and courage. You don't ask questions. You eat, you smile, and you try not to cry when it's gone in 3 bites. Even the celebration foods are practical. Spiced ale, if you can afford spices. Nut cakes, if anyone had nuts. Pies filled with dried fruits, soaked in syrup and desperation. They're more ritual than indulgence. A way to remind yourself that joy exists, even if it's crusted in soot and shared with a dozen shivering relatives. So, what did you eat in a medieval winter? Anything that wouldn't eat you first. Anything you could preserve, hide or boil until it stopped arguing. You didn't dine, you survived. Because in the end, hunger wears a wool coat. It wraps around you. It stays close. It whispers in your ear. And when spring finally arrives, the first green shoot you see, you don't admire it. You bite it. Your home in the Middle Ages is not a refuge. It is not a sanctuary. It is not, by any modern standard, a building. It's more like a wooden suggestion of shelter, loosely stapled to a dirt floor and held together by good intentions, dried mud, and the unspoken agreement that nobody sneezes too hard. Let's start with the walls. Wattle and daub if you're lucky. That's woven wooden strips covered in mud, straw, and whatever else was lying around. Cow dung, hair, gossip. You pack it all together and pray it hardens before the next storm hits. Spoiler, it doesn't. On a good day, the wind whistles through the cracks. On a bad day, the wind howls through like it owns the place and wants rent. There is no insulation. There is no sealant. There's just the outside and slightly less outside. Your roof is thatched, of course, which sounds quaint until you realise it's just dried plant matter arranged in a vaguely triangular shape. It leaks constantly. Rain comes in. Snow piles up. Birds nest in it. Mice move in and start charging rent. If you're lucky, it only partially collapses during a storm. If you're not, you wake up with your ceiling in your lap and a chicken on your face. The floor? Dirt? Just dirt? If it's muddy, you wait. If it's frozen, you slip. If it's dry, it turns to dust and gets into everything. Your lungs, your eyes, your soup. You try throwing down straw to soften it, which lasts approximately 6 hours before turning into a trampled, mouldy paste that somehow smells like feet and despair. Windows? Don't be silly. Glass is for churches and rich people. You have holes. If you're feeling fancy, maybe you stretch some oiled parchment over the opening. It lets in light and also every draught between now and Easter. Curtains? Number cloth is too valuable to waste on luxuries like privacy. Doors barely latch. Hinges groan like wounded animals. You can barricade it with a log, or if you're short on logs, because you've already burned them for heat, maybe just hope the wind isn't in a mischievous mood. Fireplaces are central, but not in a cosy way. There's a fire pit in the middle of the room. No chimney, just a hole in the roof. So the smoke rises slowly, filling your home with a lovely grey fog that coats your walls, your lungs, and any hope you had of clear breathing until spring. You don't smell the smoke after a while. You are the smoke. Now let's talk furniture. You don't have much. A wooden bench, maybe a stool. A table if you're living the high life. Beds are shared with your spouse, your children, and occasionally livestock. The mattress is straw stuffed into a sack, which sounds fine until you remember that straw doesn't stay fluffy. It compresses, moulds, and invites bugs. Your pillow is another sack. If you're lucky, it's full of feathers. If you're not, it's just more straw, possibly slightly less crunchy. Blankets? Wool, if you've got it. Or furs, if something nearby died recently. Most nights, you sleep in your clothes, under everything you own, hoping body heat plus faith equals survival. And if your fire dies out overnight, you wake up frozen in your own breath cloud, questioning every decision that led to this point. Heating the place is a challenge. You keep the fire going, sure, but heat rises, smoke rises, and unfortunately, you're sleeping on the floor, which means your toes freeze while your rafters get a lovely sauna experience. Stones around the hearth help. They absorb heat and release it slowly, but only if you have enough fuel to make them warm in the first place. You seal up cracks with moss, cloth, or mud. It doesn't work. The wind finds a way. It always finds a way. There are days when you swear the air inside is colder than the air outside. And you do something about it, but your fingers are too numb to untie your cloak. Lighting's another delight. You've got tallow candles, which drip, sputter, and reek of beef fat. Or rushlights. Reeds dipped in animal grease, which burn like someone tried to weaponize a salad. The smoke from these mingles with the hearth smoke, until the whole room is a low hanging haze of medieval asthma triggers. And let's not forget the noise. Thin walls mean you hear everything. The wind, the livestock, your neighbour sneezing, your own stomach growling back at you, like it's filing a complaint. Privacy? A myth? Solitude? Only if you walk into the forest and don't come back. Of course, it's not just people living here. Your cottage shares space with animals. Chickens nest in corners. A goat sleeps under the table. If you've got a cow, she lives in the lean-to attached to the wall, unless it's too cold, in which case she joins you in the main room. There is no such thing as indoor and outdoor. There is only not dead from the cold. This makes the house warmer, slightly. It also makes it louder, messier, and smell like a barn that recently lost a bet. You sweep the floors, but the dirt just rearranges itself. The straw bedding smells like old milk. And if a chicken decides to lay an egg next to your head in the middle of the night, you say thank you and try to fall back asleep before it poops on your blanket. Your roof also houses guests, birds, rats, insects. The thatch is thick enough for nesting, which means, come spring, you'll hear the pitter-patter of tiny feet above you at all hours. Sometimes they fall in. It's normal. You scream. The rat screams. And then you both pretend it never happened. Maintenance? Constant. Daub cracks. Rafters bend. Doors sag. The wind tears the roof. You fix what you can with what you have, and which is string, hope, and a very dull knife. You can't afford nails. You wedge things into place. You hammer wood together using a rock and a prayer. And if it's raining and the roof's leaking, you don't grab a bucket. You grab all the buckets. You position them around the house like you're trying to win a very sad game of splash chess. You learn which spots drip first. You name them. You curse them. You learn to sleep around them. It's not all doom. There are warm moments. The fire catches well. Someone shares a fur. A draft stops for no reason. You convince yourself it's your craftsmanship. You huddle close with your family and pretend the smell is comforting. It's not. But it is familiar. Still you endure it. Because this isn't just a pile of timber and bad smells. It's home. It's where you were born, where your children were born, and where someone probably died last week. You patch it. You sweep it. You whisper to it in winter, like it's a sick relative. Just hold on a little longer. You don't compare it to a castle. You compare it to not freezing to death. And by that measure, it's doing fine. Some wealthier peasants whitewash the walls. Not for luxury, for lice. The lime kills bugs. A fresh coat every year keeps the walls bright and the infestations mostly cosmetic. You think about doing it. You even collect the lime. But then the firewood runs out again. You hang herbs to make the air smell nicer. They dry out, crumble, fall into your soup. You eat them anyway. The taste is weird, but you tell yourself it's seasoning. It's not. And every so often you dream of a second room, of a wooden floor, of a roof that doesn't make you flinch every time a breeze picks up. You don't expect it. You just let the thought sit with you while you stitch another patch into the wall and listen to the rain come through the ceiling. Because in the end, your house isn't warm or dry or peaceful, but it's still standing. And in a medieval winter, that's about as close to luxury as you're ever going to get. It's dawn, or close enough. There's a faint light outside that might be the sun, or just the moon giving up. Either way, it's time to get up. Not because you're rested, you're not. Not because you're excited, you're definitely not. But because your life depends on getting things done before frostbite, famine, or your neighbour's goat beats you to the water source. There's no weekend. There's no me time. There's barely enough time to scrape the frost off your eyebrows. Every day is a repeat of the last. Gather, mend, feed, carry, boil, patch, repeat. Winter in medieval Europe is a season-long to-do list, written in mud, smoke, and fatigue. First job, get the fire going. You hope the embers survived the night. If not, you're back to flint and steel, hunched over kindling with frozen fingers, and breath so visible it could be mistaken for a ghost. Wood is precious. You use it sparingly. A good fire means warmth, food, light, and life. A bad one means all of the above slowly slip away while you pretend you're not crying from smoke. Once the fire's going, or at least coughing along like an asthmatic squirrel, it's time for water. The bucket is heavy, the The stream is half frozen, and the path is icy enough to host the worst Olympics event in history. Peasant figure skating. You fall, you spill, you curse the ice, the bucket, and the cruel joke that is winter. Then you do it again, because water doesn't fetch itself. Back home, you boil it. Not because you're a health nut, but because it might kill you otherwise. Every sip is a gamble. Boiling water is also how you warm your hands, steam the hut, and delay feeling like a medieval failure for 10 more minutes. Next, animals. They need feeding before you do. Chickens are annoyed, pigs are loud, the cow is judging you. You scrape together old hay, kitchen scraps, and whatever hasn't frozen solid. You check the coop for eggs. There aren't any. Again. The rooster, however, has plenty of opinions. If it snowed overnight, you clear the path to the door. Not because it's tidy, but because falling into a snowdrift while holding a bucket of pig slop is the kind of memory that sticks. You shovel with a flat plank, your hands wrapped in rags, and mutter things that will get you excommunicated if anyone heard. With the animals fed, and your fingers halfway thawed, it's time for breakfast, if you can call it that. Yesterday's pottage reheated with today's regrets. Maybe some crusty bread. Maybe not. If someone remembered to scrape the pot clean last night, you're scraping the scrapings. No one complains. Complaining takes energy. Then it's time for the real work. If you're a man, it's chores in the fields, forest, or forge. If you're a woman, it's everything else. Spinning wool, mending clothes, making food, cleaning soot, hauling water, stirring the pot, and somehow keeping 6 children alive while pretending your hands aren't frozen into claw shapes. Repairing the roof? That's your job. Fetching firewood? Also your job. Making sure the goat doesn't freeze, escape, or explode? Still your job. There are no task lists, just a rolling stream of crises that need solving before nightfall. Laundry is once a week, and it's its own form of purgatory. You drag clothes to the river, break through the ice, and scrub with a mix of ash and lye until your knuckles bleed and your soul leaves your body. Rinse. Freeze. Repeat. Cooking is a game of improvisation and lowered expectations. You stir the same pot you used yesterday. You skim the surface for mould and add more water. Maybe some herbs. Maybe a pebble for texture. You serve it hot and call it soup. Afternoons are for fixing things. Tools, fences, relationships strained by arguments over who ate the last turnip. You sharpen blades with a whetstone that's older than your grandfather, who, incidentally, died falling off the same ladder you now use to patch the ceiling. Children help, in theory. Mostly they get underfoot, but even toddlers are handed tasks, holding yarn, scaring crows, carrying small bundles of kindling. They work because they have to. Playtime is what happens when they finish early, and no one ever finishes early. Inside, the spinning wheel turns endlessly. Wool doesn't spin itself. Linen doesn't weave itself. Every thread in every tunic has passed through hands that ache. Gloves are a luxury. Calluses are standard issue. And if you drop a spindle and it rolls into the fire, you just stare for a moment and quietly consider walking into the flames after it. By late afternoon it's already dim. The sun barely tries in winter. Shadows stretch long. You rush to finish the day's tasks before the light fails. You patch walls with mud, rehang door hinges, fix a leaking roof with nothing but straw, a rock, and wildly misplaced optimism. Then you prep for the evening, stir the stew, stoke the fire, scrape the frost off the inside of your water bucket. You change into warmer clothes, which are the exact same clothes, but with one more layer of sadness. Dinner arrives, such as it is. A bit of stew, some bread, a communal mug of weak ale, or water that's been boiled 3 times just to make it less deadly. You sit near the hearth. Not too close, sparks, not too far, frostbite. You eat fast. The warmth fades quickly. Afterward there's no winding down. You're still spinning thread, mending socks, patching cloaks, scraping soot. Children sleep near the fire in a tangle of limbs and snoring. Adults stay up, not for leisure, but because the fire needs tending and tomorrow's firewood needs hauling. If you're lucky, there's a song. Someone sings softly while spinning or shelling peas. It's not joyful, but it is comfort. A reminder that life still exists outside the labour. Just barely. Night falls early. You lay down in the same clothes, under the same damp blanket, on the same straw mattress. You listen to the wind rattle the shutters. You hear the goat fart in its sleep. You hope the roof holds. You hope tomorrow is warmer, or at least not worse. You fall asleep mid-thought. Not because you're calm, but because exhaustion is the only lullaby you can afford. Of course, this is just one day. Tomorrow you do it all again. Every chore repeats. Every moment aches. There's no such thing as catching up, only falling behind more slowly. Holidays are rare and misleading. A day off might mean attending church in the cold, standing for hours while a priest reminds you that suffering is good for the soul. Then you return home and catch up on the chores you couldn't do because of all that spiritual enrichment. The rhythm of winter life is monotony with stakes. You don't do chores to feel productive. You do them because not doing them means someone doesn't eat, doesn't warm up, doesn't make it through February. The margin for error is microscopic. A torn cloak, a lost hat, a broken tool, all potential disasters. Every task, no matter how small, hums with quiet urgency. And still, you keep going, because you must. Because no one else is going to haul that water, mend that wall, feed that goat, or boil that grey, slightly suspicious stew. This is your life. This is your winter. And the chore never ends. Sometimes you wonder what it would be like to rest. Truly rest. To sit, to breathe, to not have a list in your head that stretches from dawn to dusk. But rest is a luxury. Movement is survival. So you shift the logs, fold the wool, quiet the baby. Nod to your spouse across the hearth. Another day done. Another set just like it to come. The work doesn't stop, but neither do you. Even in sleep, your body aches with memory. The blisters, the burns, the bruises. They don't heal. They just become part of you. Like the smoke in your clothes. Like the frost on the windowsill. Like the life you never chose, but live anyway. You don't choose to get sick in the Middle Ages. You just wake up one morning and realise your nose won't stop running. Your throat feels like you gargled pine cones. And someone seems to be inflating your joints from the inside. Congratulations. You're now fighting off something that doesn't have a name, a cure, or even polite bedside manner. You're not sure if it's a cold, the flu, or medieval tuberculosis. But it's yours now. Getting sick in the winter is almost a rite of passage. The hut is damp. The air is cold. The fire went out during the night, and you've been breathing in smoke, goat dander, and spores from the wall moss since October. No one knows what germs are yet, but your body does, and it's currently throwing a tantrum about it. Everyone coughs, everyone sneezes. No one covers their mouth, because nobody has tissues, And personal hygiene is just a rumour. The children are all sick. The old people are sick. The livestock might be sick. You? You're holding on, barely, by drinking boiled nettle tea and hoping the smell alone doesn't finish you off. The remedies? Oh, you're going to love them. There's bleeding, of course. That's the go-to for everything from headaches to heartbreak. Someone shows up with a dull knife or a friendly neighbourhood leech and decides the solution to your fever is less blood. Does it work? Absolutely not. Does it make you lightheaded enough to forget your symptoms for a while? Yes, actually. Then there's the herbal tea route, mixtures of whatever dried weeds the village healer found before the snow came. Yarrow, wormwood, nettle, maybe a handful of unidentified moss, and a generous pinch of superstition. You boil it in a cracked clay pot, strain it through your sleeve, and sip it slowly while trying to ignore the fact that it tastes like bitter mud and betrayal. Of course, you might also be advised to fast, because clearly what a body fighting off infection needs is less food. Bread is already hard to come by. Pottage has turned to grey sludge. Fasting for spiritual purification is just code for rationing when the pantry looks like a haunted pantry. Other cures include steam inhalation from the same pot you just boiled your soup in, prayer, the longer the better, and, in extreme cases, applying hot coals near the skin to draw out the poison, which works about as well as it sounds. Medical help, such as it is, depends entirely on who shows up first. If it's the village healer, you might get a poultice and some herbs. If it's the priest, expect prayers, holy water, and a gentle reminder that maybe you brought this on yourself by skipping mass. And if it's the barber surgeon, well, start writing your will. The barber surgeon arrives with a sack of instruments that haven't seen soap since the last plague. He's cheerfully optimistic. You, less so. He looks at your swollen leg and mutters something about humours, then pulls out a saw and a tankard of ale. Anaesthetic? Don't be silly. You'll bite on a stick and scream into the void like everyone else. Sometimes they'll prescribe purging, either up or down, depending on which end is more offended by your condition. Laxatives made from boiled bark or dried beetles, emetics brewed from wine and sadness. You're not just sick anymore. You're violently sick, aggressively sick, the kind of sick that leaves you questioning your commitment to staying alive. Still, some people do recover. You lie in your straw bed for days, sweating through wool, alternating between shivering and hallucinating. The fire is low. The hut is dark. The air smells like damp wool and whatever herbal nightmare you drank earlier. And somehow you pull through. But not everyone is so lucky. Illness spreads fast in a small sealed box filled with smoke, livestock, and zero ventilation. You cough. Your child coughs. Your neighbour coughs through the wall. Within a few days, half the village is sniffling, wheezing, or laid out flat under mouldy blankets, being fed onion water and last rites in equal measure. No one knows what's causing it, so naturally people guess. Maybe it's bad air. Maybe it's a curse. Maybe old Maud gave someone a funny look in church last week, and now the whole street's coughing blood. Superstition mixes with desperation until you're hanging herbs over doorways, burning dried sage, and sleeping with iron under the bed to ward off evil spirits. It doesn't work, but at least it smells nicer than the goat. The worst part is you can't stop working. You're sick, but the firewood still needs chopping. The cow still needs milking. Your kids still expect dinner. even if it's just a steaming bowl of hope and nettles. Rest is a luxury reserved for corpses. So you stagger out of bed, wrap yourself in every piece of wool you own, and shuffle through the snow like a disgruntled ghost. And all the while, the risk looms that this won't just be a cold, that it's the start of something darker. Typhoid, pneumonia, the kind of thing that doesn't announce itself, just takes you quietly in the night. That's the real fear, not the pain, but the silence that follows. If the sickness gets worse, the signs are clear. The fever spikes. Your breath rattles. You stop getting out of bed. Someone lays a cloth over your forehead and pretends it's helping. The priest is summoned. Not the healer, not the barber. Just the man in robes who says it's time to prepare your soul. Confession comes quickly. You mumble out every sin you can remember, even ones you probably didn't commit, just to cover your bases. The priest nods solemnly and sprinkles you with holy water that smells faintly of mildew and desperation. He says words in Latin. You don't understand them, but they sound final. Your family gathers. No one says it, but they're preparing. The pot of herbs simmers quietly. Bread is saved. A blanket is tucked in a little tighter. There's a moment, just one, where you lock eyes with your spouse and realise neither of you is sure which of you will survive this winter. But sometimes, mercifully, the fever breaks. One morning you wake up and the fire is still burning. Your breath doesn't catch. Your fingers can move. The room still smells like death warmed over, but at least it's warm. You've made it, barely, and now comes the long road back to functional. Recovery, however, is not glamorous. Your legs are weak. Your back aches. You haven't eaten solid food in days, and even if you had some, your stomach's not convinced it wants it. You get up too fast and nearly faint into the fire. Your first trip outside feels like crossing a frozen tundra on legs made of disappointment. No one throws a celebration. You just pick up where you left off. There's kindling to split, cloaks to mend, and a suspiciously bloated pig to investigate. If your voice still cracks from the infection, too bad. If you lost a few pounds, well, silver lining, less strain on your shoes. And just because you survived this one doesn't mean you're done. Illness never really leaves. It waits. In the corner, in the wind, in the shared mug or the unwashed cloth. You live in a world where health is a passing visitor, not a resident. Still, you carry on, because there's no other option. You cough less. You breathe a little easier. You no longer see strange shapes in the corner of the room. The colour returns to your face, along with the weight of everything that still needs doing. Because in the Middle Ages, illness comes free. But survival, that's extra. You don't brag about surviving. You don't even talk about it. You just wake up the next day, pull on your patched tunic, and start hauling water again. Because in this world, staying alive is the only proof you ever get that you were strong enough. And even that, in a winter like this, feels like a small kind of miracle. Truly, authority in medieval Europe wasn't a suggestion. It was a fact of life, like mud, cold, and that one neighbour who always smells like pickled turnips. And in the dead of winter, when hunger thinned patience and tempers ran short, obedience wasn't just expected, it was enforced. You don't talk back. You don't complain. You don't ask why unless you enjoy the taste of public punishment and splinters. From the lord of the manor to the local priest, everyone above you in the hierarchy expects immediate compliance. And they've got a belt, a staff, or a scripture ready to remind you. Start with the manor lord. He owns the land. Technically, you don't even rent it. You just live there, like a tolerated parasite. You farm his fields, pay your dues, and bow when he rides past, even if your back's already broken. If he says jump, you ask how high, then jump anyway just in case he meant it metaphorically. Refuse? That's cute. Let's see how funny that is when he finds you, takes your grain, or throws you in the stocks during a snowstorm. The stocks, by the way, are winter's least cosy seating arrangement. Wooden planks clamp your arms and neck, while your neighbours get to walk by and admire your poor life choices. It's cold. It's humiliating. And if someone's feeling festive, they might throw something. Turnips if they're nice, rocks if they're not. You don't protest. That might get you a second round. But lords weren't your only problem. The church was just as powerful, and arguably more terrifying. God might forgive, but the local priest? Not so much. He watches everything. Who misses Mass? Who works on holy days? Who might be secretly coveting someone else's goat? And he keeps a record, not just for spiritual purposes, but for leverage. One misplaced comment and suddenly you're accused of blasphemy, or witchcraft, or worse, forgetting to tithe. Speaking of tithes, they're not optional. You give 1/10 of everything you produce, even if that means you don't have enough left for yourself. Grain, eggs, chickens, your dignity. The church takes its share. And if you fall short, you don't get a reminder notice. You get a sermon delivered in front of everyone, complete with meaningful stares and eternal consequences. The preacher's power isn't in muscle, it's in memory. He remembers who skipped prayers, who whispered during Mass, who dared to question why Lent means eating boiled weeds for 6 weeks. And in the winter, when everyone's cranky and coughing, it doesn't take much to land yourself in the pulpit's line of fire. Then there's the law, or whatever passes for it. The constable is often just a farmer with a stick and a vague sense of authority. Laws are less about justice and more about keeping people in line. Steal bread, lose a hand. Say something cheeky to a noble, lose a tongue. Gossip too loudly, get fitted for a scold's bridle. A lovely little iron mask with a mouthpiece designed to make you think twice before speaking a third time. Even private matters come with public consequences. If your child misbehaves, you're blamed. If your spouse curses, you both suffer. Discipline is a community affair. The whipping post doesn't care whose idea it was, just that someone gets hit. And don't get too clever. Intelligence, in this world, is suspicious. Reading is for priests. Curiosity is for troublemakers. If you ask too many questions, someone might accuse you of sorcery, which comes with a complimentary drowning or bonfire. If you're a woman, the rules are even stricter. You obey your father, then your husband, then your son, in that order. You speak softly, work constantly, and never give anyone a reason to point at you and whisper witch, because once that word is in the air, it doesn't matter what you've done. Healing someone? Witch. Knowing how herbs work? Witch. Talking back? Witch with extra kindling. And let's not forget your fellow villagers. They're not just bystanders. They're part of the system. That neighbour who smiled at you during market might report you for working on a saint's feast day. That cousin who borrows your firewood might also casually mention you muttered something unholy in your sleep. Surveillance isn't digital. It's human. And deeply nosy. It's a culture of control. Everyone watches everyone else, and nobody is safe. The cold only sharpens the paranoia. Long nights breed longer grudges. One small slight, a stolen tool, a bad trade, a missing hen, can escalate into accusations, punishment, and public shame. And there's no appeal process. The closest thing to justice is hoping your Lord is in a good mood, and your priest didn't stub his toe on the altar steps that morning. Even jokes are dangerous. Say the wrong thing in the wrong tone near the wrong person, and suddenly your sense of humour is considered evidence of sedition. Laughter is fine, if it's at the Lord's joke, at the priest's sermon, or at someone currently in the stocks. Anything else is suspicious. Winter makes everything worse. People are hungrier, colder, and meaner. Punishments hit harder when your skin's already chapped and your spirit's already cracked. A slap in summer is an inconvenience. In winter, it's a deep sting that doesn't fade for days. And with no ointments, you're left to treat your bruises with snow and silence. There's no village meeting to discuss grievances. There's just top-down orders and bottom-up obedience. And if you push back, if you speak your mind, advocate for fairness, or question why Father Thomas gets extra rations every Friday, well, you're courting a punishment that might outlive your usefulness to the village. Even animals get better treatment if they're productive. A healthy ox is more valuable than an injured peasant. A goat that gives milk gets fed before you do. Your worth is measured in output and obedience, not opinion. Stay in your place. Stay quiet. Stay useful. That's the unspoken motto, and winter only underlines it in frost. And yet, people adapt. They learn to bow without bending too far. They master the art of polite silence. They say yes with their mouth and not today with their eyes. Obedience becomes a skill, part survival tactic, part social performance. Children learn early. They're taught not just how to work, but how to act, how to speak to the Lord, how to avoid the priest's gaze, how to sit still at Mass and not giggle when old Margaret snores during the homily. You don't teach them to dream big. You teach them to stay small, unnoticed, and intact. Even religion, the supposed comfort in a world this hard, is used as a leash. You're reminded weekly, sometimes daily, that obedience brings salvation. That questioning is the road to hell. That God is watching. And also, coincidentally, so is Father Thomas, who seems a little too invested in whether or not you kneel deeply enough during prayer. At night, the village is quiet. Not peaceful, just quiet. The kind of quiet that sits heavy. You listen to the fire crackle, the wind moan, and the occasional footsteps of someone trudging home from the tavern. You lie still, wrapped in wool and fear, and think about how obedience kept you alive today. Not happy, not free, but alive. Tomorrow you'll wake up and obey again. Not because you believe in the system, but because survival depends on it. The price of winter is submission, and everyone pays whether they mean to or not. You don't question the cold. You don't question the rules. You just pull on your boots, bow your head, and keep moving. Because in the medieval winter, questioning authority isn't rebellious. It's suicidal. Even your thoughts aren't entirely your own. You shape them carefully, keep them quiet, tuck them away behind your eyes. Because in a world built on obedience, even thinking freely feels like a dangerous luxury. So you obey, you endure, and you wait for spring. Because in winter, even rebellion freezes. And you've got enough to survive without adding heresy to the list. So you lower your eyes, seal your lips, and carry on, like everyone else. You're not alone out here. And that's not meant in the comforting sense. The kind people say when offering a hug. It's the kind whispered by your inner voice when something howls in the woods, and your door isn't quite shut right. Because in the medieval winter, you are surrounded by things that want your food, your warmth, and occasionally your face. Wolves are the obvious concern. By December, they're starving. By January, they're bold. They prowl the edges of the forest, closer now than in summer, noses lifted toward your chimney smoke. They smell meat. They smell fear. They smell you. And when you walk alone, maybe to fetch firewood, maybe to empty the slop bucket, they watch. Sometimes they follow. They rarely attack outright, but you've heard stories. Everyone has. Some say they wait until you slip, until your lantern goes out, until your boot catches in a snowdrift and you fall face first in silence. Then it's over fast, or not fast at all. But wolves aren't the only ones watching. There are smaller predators, quieter, sneakier, and often already inside. Rats don't care about the cold. They've made themselves at home, tucked behind sacks of barley, scurrying under your straw bed, nibbling anything remotely edible, and some things that aren't. You've heard them at night, the gnawing, the skittering. The occasional scream from someone discovering a rat had made a nest in the laundry pile. They eat grain, soap, leather. They chew through your shoes, your belts, the bindings of the only book in town. If it can be chewed, it will be. And when food runs low, truly low, rats become more than pests. They become a test of what you're willing to kill in the name of dinner. Cats help when you've got them, but a good mouser in winter is almost worth more than a child. And they know it. They lord over the cottage like tiny monarchs, demanding warmth and respect in exchange for thinning the vermin herd. If they don't feel like hunting, well, too bad. The rats resume their midnight buffet, and you wake up to something missing a corner. Then there are the dogs, not all of them friendly. Some are village strays, half-wild things with torn ears and ribs showing through their fur. Most were abandoned when food got tight. Now they roam in loose packs, sniffing at doors, chasing chickens, and occasionally cornering someone too slow to close the gate. You don't trust them, they don't trust you. They bark at ghosts and sometimes at nothing at all. But when they're hungry enough, barking turns into biting. Out in the woods, you've heard rumours of lynxes. Rare, but not impossible. A blur of fur and claws that disappears before you're even sure it was real. Mostly they avoid people. Mostly. But if one showed up in the village, no one would be surprised. Just unlucky. Boars are worse. Big, mean, and stupid. They don't hunt you. They charge you. Especially if they're cornered or desperate. You've heard of men losing legs to a wild boar tusk. Or lives. In the leanest months, some still try to hunt them for meat. Sometimes they come back with dinner. Sometimes they don't come back at all. And just when you think the outside is bad, remember, the inside isn't much safer. The cold drives more than rats indoors. Spiders, beetles, centipedes, things that crawl and crunch underfoot, all come looking for warmth. You step on them barefoot at dawn and pretend not to scream. You sweep them into the hearth and watch them sizzle, then go back to stirring your soup like nothing happened. If you're storing food for winter, dried meat, apples, cheese, or salted fish, you guard it like treasure. Not because you're greedy, because you're in competition with everything else that breathes. The mice are relentless. The mould creeps faster than your fingers can scrape. And the family dog, if you have one, has taken to staring at the larder door like it's made of dreams. Some families hang food from the rafters to keep it safe, which works, until something climbs the wall and steals it anyway. You've found half-eaten sausages on the floor, tiny bite marks in your bread, and worse, droppings in the flour bin. You wipe them out, close the lid, and pretend it's still usable. Because waste is luxury, and you can't afford either. Even birds get strange in the cold. Crows seem to follow you, perching on rooftops, watching from fence posts, silent and waiting. You tell yourself it's superstition, but then you see 3 of them on the same beam above your front door, and wonder if they know something you don't. Winter sharpens everything. Sound carries further. Footsteps in snow echo louder. When you hear something outside, snapping branches, low growls, even the rhythmic crunch of approaching boots, your heart doesn't race. It locks up. Because sometimes it isn't an animal. Sometimes it's a person who's just as hungry as a wolf, and twice as desperate. Bandits don't take the season off. They're colder, hungrier, and more reckless. If they think your family has food, they might try the door, or break it down, which is why you sleep lightly with a blade near the bed, dull, rusted, but sharp enough to give you a fighting chance. You pray you never have to use it. And so, every noise becomes a question. Every gust of wind, every creak in the roof, every bump against the wall. Is it just the cold settling in? Or something trying to get in? You start to learn the language of winter. The way snow falls when something has moved through it. The silence that means something's watching. You listen differently. You think differently. You begin to count your food in days, not weight. You tuck your hands under your arms whenever you're not working, not because it's warm, but because frostbite doesn't ask permission. And you never, ever let your guard down. Because predators don't knock. They don't announce themselves. They just arrive, teeth bared, claws out, cold as the season itself. The church might preach that God watches over you, even in winter. But God doesn't patrol your chicken coop. He doesn't chase rats out of the cellar. And he doesn't leave tracks in the snow just beyond your door. So you check the locks. You double knot the rope. You leave the fire burning low and the knife where you can reach it. And when you sleep, it's the kind that ends at the smallest sound. Half rest, half readiness. Because winter isn't just cold. It's alive. It's hungry. And it's always waiting. In the mornings, you check for tracks. Not out of curiosity. Out of necessity. A single line of paw prints across your garden means something visited. Maybe just passing through. Maybe scouting. Sometimes it's foxes, nosing around the chicken coop. Sometimes it's worse. You shovel snow from the path, not just to walk safely, but to erase evidence, to make your home look less tempting to whatever might be watching from the tree line. Some people hang charms above their doors. Bits of bone, carved wood, sprigs of dried herbs. Protection, they say. Against animals. Against spirits. Against luck turning sour. Whether they work is anyone's guess, but no one dares remove them. Your dreams turn strange. Teeth, eyes, heavy footsteps. You wake in a sweat, breath fogging in the cold air, and listen, just in case. Because winter in the medieval world doesn't just test your strength, it tests your sanity. It frays your nerves, your sleep, your sense of safety. Every dark night is a dare. Every howl a reminder. Out here, you're not at the top of the food chain. You're just another creature trying to survive the cold. So you carry on. Eyes open, doors shut tight. Because in a medieval winter, staying warm is only half the battle. The rest is making sure nothing eats you before spring. And if something is hungry enough, it won't care whether you've prayed, prepared, or hidden well. It will just come, and you'll need to be ready. Because in a world like this, even rebellion freezes. When your food is gone, your toes are numb, and your roof leaks more than it covers. There's only one place left to turn. God. Or more specifically, the medieval church, which depending on the day is either your salvation or one more mouth demanding something from you. Religion in the Middle Ages wasn't optional. It was oxygen. It filled every hour, every room, every thought, especially in winter, when death felt closer than ever and plagues liked to show up uninvited. You didn't just believe in God. You structured your life around the idea that He was watching, and that He wasn't thrilled. The church didn't just offer comfort, it offered rules, rigid ones. You attended Mass, even if the church was colder than outside. You fasted on command. You confessed things you weren't entirely sure were sins. And if you didn't, the consequences weren't just spiritual. They were social. People noticed, people talked, and nobody wanted to be the reason the harvest failed or the fever spread. The church building itself was no haven. Stone walls, dirt floors, a draft that seemed to aim directly at your spine. You'd huddle beside your neighbours, trying not to shiver loud enough to be accused of weakness, while the priest, layered in robes and spiritual authority, droned Latin none of you understood. But you nodded anyway, because it wasn't about comprehension. It was about obedience. Mass didn't pause for weather. If the river froze over, you crossed it. If your child had a cough that sounded like the devil himself had taken up residence in their lungs, you wrapped them up and brought them along. Missing Mass wasn't just frowned upon, it was noted. By the priest, by your neighbours, by that one old woman who never blinked and always sat in the front pew. And let's not forget tithing. 10% of everything you had, or were supposed to have, went to the church. Not 10% of your surplus. 10% of everything. Whether your family was living on turnip broth and stringy boiled oats didn't matter. The Lord still needed his cut. Apparently, heaven had expenses. During winter, religion wasn't just ritual. It was survival theatre. People prayed for everything: warmth, food, health, the strength not to strangle their in-laws after 3 months of being snowed in. Every problem had a saint. Sick cow? Saint Eligius. Frozen fingers? Saint Polycarp, probably. Lost your axe in the river? Saint Anthony. Lost your mind trying to survive January? Saint Dymphna, patron saint of those just barely holding it together. And then there were relics, bones, teeth, splinters of alleged crosses, handkerchiefs that once touched someone holy. These were housed in glass cases, silver boxes, or whatever could be fashioned out of melted down spoons. People would trudge through snow and slush for miles just to glimpse one, kiss it, and whisper a prayer. Not because they fully understood the theology, but because they were out of options. Miracles, at least in theory, were always possible. You could be healed, your baby could recover, your pig might stop foaming at the mouth, and if none of that happened, Well, perhaps it was your fault for not believing hard enough. Or for that unconfessed sin you were pretending didn't count because it happened in the dark. Confession was its own sort of winter ritual. You'd kneel in a wooden booth, knees frozen, voice low, whispering your sins to a man who already suspected what you were going to say. The priest didn't flinch. He'd heard worse. Always had. Adultery, theft, envy. That time you accidentally ate bacon on a fast day. You said your piece, got your penance, and left the booth feeling briefly lighter, until the guilt crept back in 5 minutes later. And then came fasting. Advent, Lent, Saint days, no meat, no eggs, sometimes no dairy, in the middle of winter. When you already hadn't tasted meat in a month, and your last egg froze solid before you could crack it. You'd huddle over your sad little stew, made from whatever hadn't moulded yet, and call it holy sacrifice. But you didn't dare question it. The church was everywhere. It owned land. It controlled calendars. It collected dues. And it told you explicitly that everything you endured in this life would be worth it if you followed the rules. And if you didn't, eternal fire. Not metaphorical fire. Actual burning, shrieking, forever fire. That's what waited for you if you slipped up. The weather itself was a sermon. A sudden storm. God's warning. A stretch of mild days. God's mercy. A frozen crop. Someone sinned. Who? Unclear. But someone. This turned villages into moral pressure cookers. Neighbours watched neighbours. The widow who muttered too loudly during Mass. The man who skipped Vespers. The child who asked too many questions. Any of them could be the reason the goats froze. The line between spiritual and social punishment blurred quickly. Gossip spread like frost across a field. You'd hear whispers, "She doesn't kneel properly," or "I saw him work on the Sabbath." The next thing you knew, you were at the centre of a prayer circle, or an accusation. And while you were freezing your extremities off, trying to be a good person, the priest lived just a little warmer. Not wealthy by noble standards, but definitely better off than you. He had wine. Actual wine. A private chamber. Possibly a feather pillow. And he reminded you often that your suffering was part of God's plan, which was convenient for him. Less so for you, but you still listened. Because what else was there? Hope, no matter how dim, was the product the church traded best. In a world where your child could die from a cough, and your neighbour could vanish beneath a collapsing roof, heaven offered a kind of cruel comfort. If this life was nothing but mud, hunger, and cold, then surely the next would be better. Golden streets, warm light, no frostbite, no rats. You held on to that vision, not because it made sense, but because it had to. Because otherwise you were just surviving for the sake of suffering, and that was too much for anyone to admit out loud. You'd carve little crosses into the beams above your bed, whisper rosaries in the dark, tie charms to your belts, saints for safety, saints for sleep, saints for not dying before morning. Every tiny ritual was rebellion against despair. You couldn't fix the cold. You couldn't fix the hunger. But maybe you could stay in God's good graces long enough to see spring. And that meant keeping the faith. Even if your knees bled from kneeling. Even if your prayers went unanswered. Even if, deep down, you weren't sure anyone was listening. And when someone did die, which in winter was often, it was the church that guided their body to rest. Or tried to. The ground was frozen. Graves had to be hacked open with picks, or left shallow and marked for later. The priest would mutter Latin over a frost-covered shroud, incense freezing mid-swing, as the living buried the dead with red fingers and numb faces. Sometimes the body couldn't even be moved. A makeshift service might be held in a barn, or right there in the house, as family members huddled beside the wrapped form, praying it wouldn't attract wolves before morning. But the church had answers for that too. Death was a passage, a test. The cold couldn't follow you into heaven. The hunger would end. The pain was temporary, if you believed, and if you obeyed. So even in the worst moments, kneeling in a church so cold, your breath fogs the hymnal, confessing sins just to feel some control, praying to a saint you barely remember the name of, you kept going. Because faith, in the medieval winter, wasn't just about salvation. It was about survival. And when the cold howled loudest, it wasn't the fire or the food that kept people going. It was the quiet hope that someone, somewhere, was listening. Because in a world ruled by frost and famine, belief was the last thing that couldn't be taken. There's a lie people like to believe about winter, that it ends in March. That spring arrives like clockwork, just when it's needed most. Flowers blooming, birds returning, the sun stretching its golden fingers across thawing fields. But in the Middle Ages, winter didn't care about calendars. It came when it wanted, left when it was finished. And sometimes it didn't leave at all. March could be just as cruel as January. Snow still fell. Ice still clung to the eaves like it had paid rent. The wind kept howling, and the sun stayed low, pale, and deeply unhelpful. Mud replaced snow, but that didn't mean life got easier. It just meant your boots got heavier. Spring was a rumour. Hope was a dangerous luxury. By the time the snow finally melted, the damage had already been done. The ground thawed, yes, but the people didn't. What winter didn't freeze, it starved. What it didn't starve, it broke. Bones, tools, spirits. Some families came through it thinner. Some didn't come through at all. You'd walk into town in April and find doors still shut, chimneys still cold. No smoke, no footprints, just silence and that particular kind of stillness that means someone didn't make it. Maybe it was the old man whose cough never got better. Maybe it was the woman who gave her bread to her children until there wasn't enough left for herself. Maybe it was the child who got sick in February and just faded. Funerals were quiet affairs, if they happened at all. By late winter, the graveyard had filled faster than anyone expected. The earth was too hard to dig properly for most of the season, so bodies were sometimes wrapped and kept in barns or caves until the ground could be broken. You'd smell them before you saw them, and even if you survived, you didn't exactly celebrate. You didn't burst into song at the sight of a crocus. You stared at the dirt like it owed you something, like maybe, if you waited long enough, it would give something back. Food, hope, a reason. Spring was not a joyful rebirth. It was a slow, muddy crawl out of the grave you nearly slipped into. You were alive, yes, but different. A little quieter, a little thinner. You laughed less. You trusted less. You had seen what hunger could do, what cold could steal, what desperation could turn people into. You didn't talk about it, not directly, but you saw it in each other, in the way people flinched at loud noises, hoarded crumbs, stared too long at piles of firewood as if counting them like coins. You could tell who had seen someone die. You could tell who had buried their own. And the hunger didn't end just because winter did. Your stores were empty, your livestock thin. Nothing had grown yet. It would be weeks, months even, before the fields fed you again. Until then, it was the waiting game. You boiled the same roots. You baked the same rock-hard bread. You hoped the rains came and not another frost. And then there was the work. Winter didn't just starve you. It broke your tools, rotted your thatch, collapsed your sheds. Spring meant fixing everything. Fences, roofs, wheels, muscles. You had to patch, plant, chop, haul. There were no breaks, just new tasks stacked on top of the old ones. You planted seeds with fingers still cracked from frost. You hoed soil while coughing up the tail end of a January illness. You did all this while pretending you weren't still hungry, weren't still grieving, weren't still having dreams about being chased barefoot through snow by something with your brother's face. Records from the time, where they exist, speak more in silence than statistics. Parish logs list who was buried, but not why. Chroniclers write of harsh seasons, of unusual mortalities. They don't mention that a village of 60 might be 40 by April, that 10-year-olds looked 20, that women miscarried from cold alone. What we know is this: medieval winter wasn't something you got through. It was something you survived, in the strictest sense. You made it to the other side, not untouched, not whole, just breathing. And even that was rare. No one talked about trauma. The word didn't exist. But the symptoms did. In every hollow stare, every child who flinched at the wind, every man who woke up shouting in the middle of the night. You were expected to move on, to rebuild, to be grateful. But some people didn't move on. Some stopped talking. Some drank more. Some prayed more. Some just faded. They worked the fields without speaking, ate without tasting, looked through their families like strangers. These were the survivors too. The church offered language for some of it: divine testing, trials, purification through suffering. But even that started to feel thin when your baby didn't wake up, or your mother was buried with the thaw. God's will only goes so far before it starts sounding like a shrug. But still, you kept going, because there wasn't another option. You fed the chickens. You mended the door. You taught your surviving child how to tell if the flour had gone sour. Life resumed, not because it got better, but because no one told it to stop. And eventually, one day in late May, something green would appear. Not much, just a sprout. A weed, probably. But still. It was enough to stop and look at. Enough to feel, briefly, like the world might soften again. Spring didn't erase anything. It just buried it under fresh chores and thinner shadows. The losses stayed. The silence remained. You remembered every name that didn't make it. And when the thaw revealed things lost in snow, a boot, a rusted knife, a child's doll, you picked them up gently and didn't say a word. You'd hear laughter again eventually. Quiet, careful laughter. Around a new fire, beside a pot of something marginally more edible. It wouldn't last long, but it was something. A child might chase a chicken through the yard. Someone might play a tune on a battered flute. The smell of wet earth and budding grass replaced the stink of mildew and death. Not joy, not yet, but motion. And that was the best you could ask for. You didn't expect happiness, just less pain. You learned to plant early, to store better, to brace harder. But you also knew, deep in your bones, that next winter could be worse. It was always just a matter of when. And so you lived, with scars, with stories, with a cautious kind of hope. You didn't talk about the worst of it, because what was the point? Everyone had their own version. Everyone had frozen fingers, buried kin, or nights they weren't sure they'd wake from. You walked past the churchyard and didn't look too long. You saw the new growth and felt the old grief. And when someone asked how your winter was, you just nodded, said, "We made it." Because that was all anyone ever said. The truth was longer, messier, colder. It lived in the corners of the room, in the way you wrapped your cloak tighter, even in the sun, in the way you counted your food twice, in the way you listened for wolves, even in spring. Survival wasn't triumph. It was just endurance. But in the Middle Ages, that was enough. So you wiped your hands, fed the fire, planted the next seed, and waited for the cold to come again. Because in a time when nothing was promised, not warmth, not food, not tomorrow, making it through winter was the closest thing peasants had to a miracle. And for most, there were no songs, no records, no legacies, just another spring, and the quiet proof that they were still here. Because survival didn't make you a hero, it just meant you were still standing when the snow finally gave up. And that, in the medieval winter, was the only victory that mattered. One more breath, one more season. Endure.